Hey, I'm Matt, and today on Grace Online, we're finishing up a series that we've called Villains, where instead of learning from the heroes, we've been taking some lessons from some of the Bible's greatest villains. And today, we're talking about choosing the right battle. I'm sure right now, there are fights that you have the option to enter at home, at work, and definitely on social media, but not all fights are created equal. And when we pick the wrong fights, we lose focus and energy for the most important ones that we should fight. Take a listen.
I got punched in the face for the first time when I was in 8th grade. I completely deserved it. I was being a jerk to another kid in my class. And even when he punched me, I looked back at him and just kind of shrugged, like, I know I deserved that. But I've never actually been in a fight, like an exchanging of punches or anything like that. I've always thought of myself as the type of person who could talk my way out of a fight. But I've found that most of us are like me, and that you might have never been in a physical altercation before. You've never fought somebody, but fighting itself does come naturally to most people. So you don't have to know somebody for very long or know them well to feel like you're free to disagree with them and tell them that you disagree with them. Being a contrarian about something that you've done little to no research on can actually be really fun. That's actually where trolling comes from. And you don't have to ask people if they disagree with you. They'll freely share it. See, fighting, disagreeing, arguing, bickering, all those things come naturally. But fighting well and fighting the right things doesn't come nearly as naturally. In a boxing match, if you've ever been to a fight, you've seen a UFC event, anything like that, professional wrestling, it's really important to fight well. Like using the right type of technique, keeping your hands high to guard your face, and even when you punch, putting your hips into it so you get more power. Like all of those things help you fight well with better technique, and all of them help you protect yourself from injury and from a stray punch. And in a similar way, fighting well in life protects you. It helps you not fight in a way that causes you to push people you care about far from you. But it also protects you from your ego that wants to say that the most important thing about a fight is winning it, when the truth is no one wins in a fight when you lose the person that you're fighting with. And if you've been to a boxing match, UFC event, or professional wrestling, anything like that, you also know that it's really important to fight the right things. See, if you've been at one of those events, there are thousands of people in the crowd, and half of them are cheering for one fighter, and the other half is rooting against that fighter. Now, if that fighter jumped out of the octagon or jumped out of the ring to try to fight everybody in the crowd, it doesn't matter how good of a fighter they are or how strong they are. They will lose that battle. Nobody is fighting 1,000 people just with their own strength. So you need to focus on the person that you're in the ring with. Because the other thing is, if they try to fight everybody else, they lost track of the one person that they're actually responsible to fight against. And in life, the same thing is true. Knowing what things to fight for or fight against is hugely important, because so often we lose ourselves in being worried about or stressing about, concerned about fighting things or fighting against people or getting in fights and arguments that God never asked us to engage in. And all the while we gain less and less ground in the battlefields that actually matter. So what I want to do this morning is I want to take a look at a guy in the Bible named Samson. Because Samson is somebody that God had given incredible strength to. In fact, God had given him all the power he needed to overcome any enemy he could find. He could win any fight he found himself in, but unfortunately, he took that as a reason to get into every fight he found any reason to get into a fight with. See, what's interesting about the guy we're looking at today, Samson, is that he was set up positionally by his title and his role to be the hero. But because of what he did personally, through his choices and his character, he became the bad guy, he became a villain. And maybe the most dangerous thing that any of us could ever be in our lives is someone who thinks that they're the hero, but acts like a villain. Someone who thinks that they're fighting well and fighting the right battles, all the while picking the wrong battles and fighting them the wrong way. In fact, Proverbs 14:12 says this. It says that there's a path before each person that seems right, but it ends in death. And that might sound like an extreme statement, but Samson's story is actually really extreme. It takes place in a book called Judges, and Judges is a chaotic book that tells the story of how the Israelites, God's chosen people, descend from a unified, God-fearing people into a people that look no different than the violent, chaotic, far from God tribes around them. See, God's dream for the Israelites had always been that they'd be a beacon and a symbol of what it would look like if a people would follow God, that they would show the goodness of God through the goodness of their decisions to follow him, that their culture, the way they cared for each other would be a beacon of the way God would want people to look and a society to look. And that didn't mean that they were the only people that God loved. The Bible makes it really clear that God loved the whole world. So he sent his only son as a sacrifice. And so if you're a Christian, that doesn't mean that you are the only people that God loves or cares about. God loves the whole world, but what he wants for his people, what he wants for anybody who would follow him, is that we would live our lives obedient to him, following him, so that our lives could be a beacon to other people of what it would look like if people would follow God. But that's also why it was so devastating when the Israelites would choose to walk away from God, to live selfishly and disobey him, because they were ripping apart the picture that God was trying to create of his desired relationship with humanity. So in this book of Judges, there's this cultural cycle that happens for the Israelites where they keep on repeating the same pattern as an entire people that reflects the inward things that were going on, their inward spiritual struggle. And so that cycle would start where they have peace with God, that they're unified with God, they're close with him, they're following him, and then they would start to sin. They'd deviate from his plan, they would deviate from his character as a people, they'd become selfish, they'd become disobedient to him. And so then God would allow one of their enemies to overtake them, reflecting the reality that their sin, their selfishness, their disobedience had already taken over their hearts. And then they'd cry out to God after this enemy had made life a living hell for them. And that reflected their need for repentance of their sin. Then God would send a rescuer, and that was foreshadowing the great rescuer, Jesus, that was going to come to rescue all people from their sin. This rescuer would bring them to a place of remembering how good God is, that he loves them and he cares for them, so then they'd be back to this place of peace again. But in Judges, the rescuers that God sends are called judges. Now, what's interesting about that is that this actually redefines the way we think of judges in God's definition, God's eyes. See, today we usually think of judges as people that just condemn people, that their job is to announce how guilty somebody is. And we'll even say, like, you don't want to leave your fate up to the judge. But that's actually not all that a judge's job is. Their job isn't just to condemn people. Their job is actually to declare what's most true about someone. See, if somebody's guilty, then yes, they better say that they're guilty. But if they're innocent, the beautiful thing about a judge is that if they declare you innocent, then it doesn't matter what all the false accusers say about you or anything like that. It doesn't matter other people's opinions, because the judge said that you were innocent. And so these judges in the book of Judges, they were actually declaring what was most true about the Israelites. They weren't saying that they were innocent because they weren't. They sinned, but they were saying they were forgiven. And so they would take the Israelites from their captivity back to this place of realizing just how close God was. They're reminding the Israelites that they didn't belong to their enemies. They belonged to their God. The judges were there to remind the Israelites who they really were and whose they were. But the judges were just as human as the Israelites. And as the Israelites continued along this cycle, their time sinning and being away from God and the time before they would choose to repent slowly got longer and longer until this cycle got worse and worse and more out of control, like a planet that or an asteroid that's going too fast. It's getting further away from what it's orbiting. They were going further and further away from the God that they claimed to believe in, that they claimed was theirs. And the judges, as the book goes on, the judges get worse and worse as well, until we reach the final judge in the book, this guy named Samson. Samson is proof that God uses broken people. He's proof that not everybody in the Bible is perfect or close to perfect. And he's also proof that having a lot of brawn and little to no brain is never good. Samson's life actually reflects a phrase that shows up 4 times in the book of Judges. And one of the occurrences of this phrase happens shortly after Samson's death. In Judges 17:6, it says, "In those days, Israel had no king. All the people did whatever seemed right in their own eyes." That actually sounds a lot like that verse in Proverbs we read that said there's a path before each person that seems right, but it ends in death. So what I want to do is I want to give you a snapshot of a day in the life of Samson. Before we start pulling out any principles from his life, I just want you to know who this guy is. And his story is strange. There's some weird components. It's confusing. At some points, his story is hard to read. But in Judges 14, Samson meets a girl that he finds beautiful. And so he does what every guy who has no game does. He sees her, thinks she's really pretty, doesn't talk to her, goes home to mom and dad and tells them about her. And so then the very next thing he does is he asks his parents to come with him to her hometown so that they can help him ask her out. Like, I think it's a good idea for a guy to have a wingman, but if your wingman is your mom, like maybe you need to readjust some of your life choices. But this is what happens. Judges 14, starting in verse 5. It says, "As Samson and his parents were going down to Timnah, a young lion suddenly attacked Samson near the vineyards of Timnah." Now, this would be where any of our stories would end. Like if you were reading an article about a family that was traveling down to Cape Cod, and it said, "Family traveling to Cape Cod attacked by lion," you go, "Oh my gosh, those poor people." But for Samson, it's not this poor family or, "Oh, poor Samson." It's, "Oh, this poor lion." Because this is the first time that we see the strength that God had blessed Samson with. I said earlier that God had given Samson all the power, all the strength to win any fight he found himself in. This is the first example of that. Verse 6, it says, "At that moment, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him, and he ripped the lion's jaws apart with his bare hands. And he did it as easily as if it were a young goat." Now, I find that hilarious because basically the comp that the writer of Judges gives for how easy this was for Samson to rip the lion in half is it was as easy as if you were ripping in half a young goat. Like, I can't do that. That would be like asking a bodybuilder what it's like to squat 600 pounds and they look at you and say, "Well, it's really no more of an effort than when I bench 500 pounds. Like, I'd just be like, "Oh yeah," because I know what that feels like. But the whole point of this is to say that Samson's on this whole other level of strength, that God has blessed him in this incredible way where he has all the power to defeat even a lion on this walk to this town. And then it says he didn't tell his father or mother about it, which also I find interesting because they were walking with him. So for them to not notice, he would have had to handle this lion so quickly and silently that they had no idea what was going on. Then it says, when Samson arrived in Timnah, he talked with the woman and he was very pleased with her, which, good job, Samson, you finally actually talked to the girl. Later, when he returned to Timnah for the wedding, he turned off the path to look at the carcass of the lion, and he found that a swarm of bees had made some honey in the carcass. He scooped some of the honey into his hands and he ate it along the way, because that would be your first move when you find honey inside a dead lion. He also gave some to his father and mother, and they ate it. But he didn't tell them that he had taken the honey from the carcass of the lion. As his father was making final arrangements for the marriage, Samson threw a party at Timnah, as was the custom for elite young men. When the bride's parents saw him, they selected 30 young men from the town to be his companions. What this tells me is just how imposing of a figure Samson was. That this lady's father sees Samson, and Samson, just his appearance, sets off every red flag for this guy. And so he doesn't say, like, I'm going to keep an eye on Samson. What he does is he hires, because Samson is so big and strong, he hires 30 guys from town to keep an eye on this guy, to be his companions. Verse 12, Samson said to them, "Let me tell you a riddle. If you solve my riddle during these 7 days of the celebration, I will give you 30 fine linen robes and 30 sets of festive clothing. But if you can't solve it, then you must give me the 30 fine linen robes and 30 sets of festive clothing." "All right," they agreed. "Let's hear your riddle." So he said, out of the one who eats came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet. Now I want to remind you, no one saw what Samson had done to the lion. He didn't tell anybody about it. So how on earth is anybody supposed to figure out that what Samson's referring to in this riddle is that on his way to town, he ripped a lion in half as easily as ripping a young goat. And then his second time into town, he found a beehive in there and ate some of the honey from that. Like, how's anybody supposed to figure out that? So by the end of the week, these guys are tired of Samson's antics. They're tired of his taunting about this riddle. And so they convince Samson's bride-to-be to get Samson to tell her the answer, and then she'll share it with them. So they end up telling Samson the answer to the riddle. He becomes furious. He gets so mad that he goes to another town. He kills 30 men from that town, takes their robes, gives it to the guys that he made a bet with, and then he goes home to live with mom and dad again. And the story gets worse. A while later, Samson gets lonely, and he decides that he's going to win over his once fiancée back over by bringing a goat. And if I was this goat, I'd be kind of nervous because I'm not sure if I'm a present or if I'm just going to be another illustration how strong Samson is. But he shows up at the house of this girl's family, and the father tells Samson that he assumed that Samson wanted nothing to do with his daughter because he stormed off and he's been gone for a while. So she's actually now married to the guy who was Samson's best man in his wedding. And this sets Samson off. And he ends up saying a line that I think explains all the reasons why Samson has lived his life the way he has up until this point. And it also explains the reason why Samson's life unravels the way it does by the end of the story. See, Samson looks at the father and he says in Judges 15:3, "This time I cannot be blamed for everything I'm going to do to you Philistines." And what follows after this moment is a violent, hard to read, disappointing path of self-destruction that leads right up to Samson's eventual death. From this moment, there's an exponential increase in the amount of destruction and chaos caused by Samson, who's supposed to be this judge, this rescuer figure for Israel. He sets fires to the Philistine crops and vineyards. The Philistines respond by invading Israel. And then Samson is confronted by 3,000 Israelite soldiers. Like, his own people are confronting him with thousands of soldiers because they're not sure if they can trust him or if he's good news for them. And then they beg him to turn himself over to his enemies. He kills another 1,000 Philistines and torments them for the rest of his life. He was supposed to be a rescuer figure. He was supposed to bring the Israelites back to this place of loving and revering their God. He's set up for success. He has all the authority and all the power that he needs to do the job well, to do what's needed. But his life, instead of being a testimony to somebody using what God has given them for good, his life ends up being a lesson in the harsh reality that if you don't own your choices, they will own you. See, he says to the father, "This time, I cannot be blamed for everything I'm going to do." In other words, this choice right here is your fault. This decision is out of my hands. What I'm about to do this time is on you. But when he says this time, it doesn't stay being this time. This time ends up becoming a pattern for the rest of his life of Samson not taking responsibility for his own actions, justifying all sorts of awful things that he could do. See, despite Samson being the judge with the most power, he ends up becoming the judge with the least impact. See, all the other judges through the book, the writers would record how long they judged Israel for, how long they were in the role of rescuer for Israel. But for Samson's life, it's the only judge that I could find where the writer adds a little piece to his story. And in Judges 15:20, it says, Samson judged Israel for 20 years during, not before, not after, but during the period when the Philistines dominated the land. See, while Samson was the judge, with all his power, with all his ability, with all his strength, Israel was still dominated by their enemies. Despite him killing more people than any other judge in the book, he did nothing to free Israel. He constantly spent his time fighting, but fighting the wrong fights the wrong way. Despite owning great power, he never owned any of his decisions or any of his choices. And after Samson burns down the crops in the vineyards of the Philistines, this is what happens. The Philistines retaliated by setting up camp in Judah and spreading out near the town of Lehi. The men of Judah asked the Philistines, "Why are you attacking us?" Which is a good question, because these guys are just farmers, they're fathers, they're husbands, they're innocent men just trying to go about their lives, and they're going, I know the Philistines are our enemies, but I didn't realize we were at like full-on war. Like, why are you invading our town? And the Philistines replied, "We've come to capture Samson. We've come to pay him back for what he did to us." So because of Samson's lack of self-control, lack of control over his temper, lack of ownership over his decision to burn the Philistines' crops, the Philistines invade Israel. See, not only do your choices end up owning you if you refuse to own them, oftentimes when you refuse to own your actions, other people end up paying for them. Now, I do just want to say, because I think whenever something like that's said, if you refuse to own your actions, other people end up paying for them. Usually what we do, at least I do this, and maybe this is just a character flaw on my part, but we tend to jump to times when other people have hurt us. But what I just want to say is if you never take ownership of the small seed of bitterness, of resentment, of jealousy, of hurt that somebody else planted in your life because of something they did to you, then eventually you're going to do something similar to somebody else along the way. Like if you refuse to own what you can do to, or what you can give to God in your heart, that little seed of bitterness or resentment, then that will end up causing other people to pay for what you didn't ask God to take away, you didn't deal with God. So how do I turn this around? Like, how do I turn patterns in my life around where I've just allowed my emotions to control my decisions, or I've allowed what other people did to justify what I do, or maybe even patterns of my life where like it seems like every time I'm in a good groove in a relationship, it feels like the relationship blows up. Or every time I get a new job, I'm going from job to job, but it seems like everything's going well, and then all of a sudden it seems like my boss's patience runs out with me, and I don't fully know what happened, but I don't like that I'm repeating this pattern. I keep on blaming other people. Like, how do I resolve that? How do I turn that around? Well, there's a line from actually a comic book that is really famous. Uncle Ben Parker, Peter Parker's uncle, Spider-Man's uncle, says, "With great power comes great responsibility." Now, I wish that line wasn't from a comic book because it's from a comic book, people don't take it as seriously. But if I were able to say like, oh, Abraham Lincoln had this great line, everybody would be like, dang, I love that quote. But it's a beautiful line because it reminds people who have power or authority to use that power and authority to equip and build up and to help other people. People with great power to use that responsibly for the greater good, for the aid of others. But the only issue I've ever had with it is it kind of implies that you don't have great responsibility until you have great power. And so for those of us who don't have great power, we don't have great wealth, we don't have great influence, like what can we actually do to use our lives responsibly, to make changes, to make a difference in our life and other people's life? Like, how do we make a real change, make a real difference, have influence? Well, this is where I've actually found the reverse of that line really powerful in my life. See, it's not just that with great power comes great responsibility. It's that with great responsibility comes great power. See, that doesn't mean that you need to take responsibility for every little thing that's ever happened in your life, because there are things that have happened that are outside of your control. Addiction actually runs really deep in my family. And because of that, there's a prayer that a lot of addiction help services use called the Serenity Prayer that has become really close to my heart. And the Serenity Prayer simply goes, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot control. God, grant me the courage to change the things that I can. And God, give me the wisdom to know the difference. See, what's interesting throughout Scripture is that if you look at what God does with people that he's leading, God never asks anybody to do the impossible. God asks people to do the possible and trust that he's working the impossible in the background. Like, one of my favorite examples of this is this guy named Moses. Moses was, he was actually an outcast from his own people for a while, that he'd killed somebody. He lived as a shepherd. And so he had the shepherd stick. And when he was rescuing God's people from Egypt, God would ask him to do things with the shepherd staff, that he'd ask him to place the staff on the ground, or he'd ask him to wave it over some water, or he'd ask Moses to hold the staff over his head. That was all God asked him to do. God didn't ask him to perform any of the miracles that Moses is associated with. But when Moses would place the staff on the ground and obey God at what he said, God turned the staff into a snake, surprising all of these magicians that were in the Pharaoh of Egypt's court, showing that this God is capable, the God of Israel is capable of more things than their gods ever could be capable of, that this God is real, that he really can do things. When Moses waved the staff over the water, which is just another small thing God asked him to do, God turned the Egyptian water into blood. And when God asked Moses to hold the staff over his head, God had promised that as long as you hold the staff over your head, the Israelites will win in this battle that they're engaging in front of Moses. God didn't ask Moses to fight an entire battle for his people against thousands of people. He just asked him to hold the staff over his head. God asked Moses to do possible things while he worked the impossible in the background. See, I think sometimes we get wrapped up in believing that we have to do everything in order to get our life back on track, that we have to do the impossible, and it can kind of be overwhelming. But can I just tell you that you don't have to get it all? You just need to trust that God can control the impossible aspects of your life, the aspects of your life that you don't have control over. So you might not fully understand how giving to God first could positively affect your life when the biggest concern you have in your life is your marriage. But just trust that God can work that out. You might not fully understand how telling the truth when lying feels more convenient will positively affect your life and change your life when your biggest concern is the anxiety you have over your student loans. But trust God with the impossible while you take the possible steps that he's asked you to take. A mentor of mine used to say that the only way we can get over what God has put under us is by getting under what God has put over us. And what he meant by that was the only way we can really get over the sin, the poor decisions, the ego, the things that have racked our lives for so long is by getting under what God has put over us, his commands, who he is, following and obeying God willingly and happily. Because in that process of doing those possible things, taking possible steps that this God has asked us to take, we will see him make a difference and make changes that we never thought were possible. That we can see impossibly heavy obstacles moved because we're choosing to trust that God is working the impossible while we take possible steps. Unfortunately, Samson didn't do this. Despite his strength, he could not overcome the weight of his ego and poor choices. And no matter how great you are at any one thing, Samson's life proves that your life will end up settling to the level of your poorest repeated choices. That Samson had great strength, but that strength could not overcome his constant decision to act selfishly, his constant decisions to lean into his own ego and do whatever felt right and do whatever he felt was justified. See, I truly believe that God wants to fill your life with peace and joy and grace and hope and mercy. He wants to fill your life to a point where it's overflowing with those things. But it's kind of like this cup. See, this is a normal cup. The only difference between this and any other cup is that there's a hole in the side of it. And it doesn't matter how well-intentioned I am, or how much water or coffee or juice or seltzer or Dr. Pepper I have. Like whatever your favorite drink is, it doesn't matter how much of that you have. If you pour all of that into a cup like this, it's never going to stay full. It will always drain out to the level of the lowest hole in the side of the cup. And I believe that God wants to fill our lives with all of his goodness. And I think if you're a follower of Jesus, you probably want that too. That you want to experience some peace, that you want to experience some joy in your life. And sometimes we'll get frustrated with God, like, God, I keep on asking that you would ease some of the chaos in my life. And he's saying, like, I've given you every reason to experience peace. But you keep on making decisions that drain you of the peace that I'm trying to fill you with. See, Samson had every opportunity to become this great man and great leader used by God, filled with his strength, filled with his goodness. But his great strength could not rescue him from his poor character. But what I want you to know is that regardless of how long you might have made poor decisions in your life, regardless of how far you've walked away from God, even if you have walked as far away from God for as long as Samson had, you still have hope because you are only one choice away from God's mercy. So you might be 1,000 choices away from getting your life where you'd like it to be, getting your life together in the way that you want it. You might be 200 choices away from having a restored marriage. You might be 3,700 choices away from getting out of debt. But you are always only one choice away, one decision away from experiencing God's forgiveness, his love for you, and his plan for your life. Samson's life doesn't have a happy ending. He keeps on making selfish decisions, and he's blinded by his own ego up until the point where he's actually physically blinded because of his egotistical decisions. His strength has been drained, and he ends up becoming a captive to the Philistines, the very people that he was supposed to rescue Israel from. And then this is what happens. Judges 16. The Philistine rulers held a great festival, offering sacrifices and praising their god Dagon. They said, "Our God has given us victory over our enemy Samson." When the people saw him, they praised their God, saying, "Our God has delivered our enemy to us. The one who killed so many of us is now in our power." Half drunk by now, the people demanded, "Bring Samson out so he can amuse us." So he's brought out from the prison to amuse them, and they had him stand between the pillars supporting the roof. Samson said to the young servant who was leading him by the hand, "Place my hands against the pillar that hold up the temple. I want to rest against them." Now the temple was completely filled with people. All the Philistine rulers were there, and there were about 3,000 men and women on the roof who were watching as Samson amused them. Then Samson prayed to the Lord, and I want you to see his tone. "Sovereign Lord, remember me again. Oh God, please strengthen me just one more time. With one blow, let me pay back the Philistines for the loss of my 2 eyes." Then Samson put his hands on the 2 center pillars that held up the temple. Pushing against them with both hands, he prayed, "Let me die with the Philistines." And the temple crashed down on the Philistine rulers and all the people. So he killed more people when he died than he had during his entire lifetime. I told you that his life was confusing and hard to read at points. And I actually had a pastor ask me when he knew that I was looking into Samson's life. He asked, "Why do you think God didn't just kill or abandon Samson?" Like, if the Israelites were supposed to be a beacon to all these other people of what it would look like to follow God, and the judge was supposed to be this redeemer figure leading the Israelites, then why didn't God just give up on Samson when he clearly wasn't choosing to follow God over and over and over again? Well, I think the reason was that the judges were actually just symbolic of the state of Israel. See, in many ways, the judges were kind of a mirror that God would hold up to his people. The first judges were imperfect people who were devoted to their God, and so they would take the imperfect Israelites away from their enemies and bring them back to a place of devotion with God. That that they weren't perfect, but they had the right intention and they were moving towards God, loved their God, and knew that they belonged to him. And then as the book goes on, you have these judges who are reflecting the distance that Israel kept on running from God until you get to Samson. And at this point, the Israelites had poorly represented God. They had gotten to battles and fights that they never belonged in. And so Samson, as their judge, is like this mirror where his entire life is about getting into fights that he never belonged in and poorly representing God until this last moment. Because in this last moment, Samson is a different man and he reflects what the Israelites needed to do too. That he ends up saying, "Sovereign Lord." Like at this point, he's not placing himself high. He's actually looking at God and he says, "Sovereign Lord." Like you are greater than me. That you are the one who my strength comes from. You're over everything. You control everything, God. And then he says, "Remember me again, O God. Please strengthen me just one more time." See, gone was the arrogance that was there before. Samson didn't pray to God for him to strengthen him when he killed those 30 men earlier in the story. And Samson didn't ask God to strengthen him, and he didn't remember God when he ripped the lion in half. But now he's asking God to just simply remember him. And God does. See, Samson was a symbol to Israel and to anybody reading that no matter how far you've wandered from God or how long you've been wandering away from God, you could have spent your whole life fighting against him, fighting the wrong battles the wrong way. But God remembers you, he sees you, and he wants you to make the one decision you need to make to turn to him. Samson's words actually remind me of a story at the end of Jesus' life. See, there's a moment at the end of Jesus' life where he's on the cross, but he's not alone on a cross. He actually has a thief on his right and on his left. And the fact that these people are just referred to as thieves tells us that they're probably more than thieves, because just being like a pickpocket wouldn't land you on the cross. They most likely were people who would brutally beat people for their possessions. And they probably did this habitually, that this was a lifestyle to them, that they'd rob people, mug them, and if they put up too much of a fight, they'd kill them. Like these are rough guys. And so they've made a life of stealing and hurting people. And they're on crosses next to Jesus. There's no way that they could like balance the scales if you believe like, if I'm good enough, then I get to heaven. Like there's no way that they could have balanced those scales, because this is it. They're on a cross. They're not going to get down and live an entire life afterwards. And so one thief looks at Jesus and he starts mocking Jesus. And he basically says, "Jesus, if you're really God, then you should get down from this cross and get me down too." Basically saying like, if you're not going to get me down, then you're not the God that I'm looking for. Even though all of his decisions, all of his life, everything that he's done up until this point has led him to a place where he deserves this type of death according to the society that he's in, according to the culture that he's in. And then the other thief speaks up and he says something a little different. See, this other thief next to Jesus looks at the first criminal and he says, "Don't you see that we deserve our punishment? That he owns what he's done. That he might not have owned it at any moment up until now, but now the gravity of what he's done through his life is setting in." He says, "We deserve this." And then he looks at Jesus and he just asks Jesus, "Lord, please remember me." The same thing Samson prayed. And Jesus doesn't just promise to remember him, he promises to be with him. So if I could just give you one takeaway right now, one actionable step, it's simply own this choice in front of you. Like you might be thousands of choices away from where you want to be, but you are only one choice away from where you need to be. What got you here doesn't have to keep you here. Maybe you've made your decisions in your life that have led you to walk far from God out of hurt and bitterness and resentment. And maybe if you're really honest enough with yourself, you'd admit that these weren't a bunch of mistakes that I've made. Like, I've actually made choices that I knew went against God's will, went against God's character, went against who God is. I'm asking you to own this choice in front of you. To own the decision to turn back to your God, to own the decision to say, God, please remember me, because I want to promise you this, that God will remember you, because he does remember you. He does love you. I heard a pastor say recently that the devil knows our name, but he calls us by our sin. But God knows our sin, but he calls us by our name. That God wants you to call on him so you can know just how intimately he knows you, and he loves you, and he's with you. So don't be overwhelmed by all the decisions you might have to make to get your life where you want to be. Make the decision today to get right where you need to be, right in front of God, confessing your sin, opening your heart to him, and just see what impossible things he can move in your life when you start applying the possible steps he's asked you to take. God, I thank you for who you are. I thank you for your great love for us, God. I'm asking that you would bring to the surface any areas of our lives where we've just been justifying our sin, justifying our bitterness, our selfishness, our actions. God, I'm asking that you would convict us of the areas of our lives where we haven't been good representatives of you, and we haven't been pursuing you. We haven't been following you, God. Don't let us have like a seared conscience where we no longer care if we're following or not, God. Rescue us from a spirit like Samson had for all his life. Give us the courage to own our decisions. And God, give us the conviction to own whatever choice, whatever decision is in front of us right now, God. If there's something that maybe we've been putting off, if there's somebody that we need to forgive that we haven't for a long time, if there's a conversation that we need to have with somebody that we've been pushing off, but we know it's going to be good for them and it's going to be good for us, God, help us have that conversation. If there's an area of our life that we've just allowed selfishness to take over, God, help us make the decision to put you first there. God, I thank you for stories like Samson, as hard as they are to read, because they're a reminder that you love us and you're giving us chances and opportunities to turn to you throughout our life. But right now is the moment where we need to choose to turn to you, God. Amen.
Well, this has been such a fun series to do with all of you, and if you have missed any of the weeks, you can find them all on our website, or you can search for That's Grace Church on YouTube. And for this whole series, we've been diving deeper every week into what the Bible has to say through our devotional reading plans. And if that is something that you want to join in learning how to fight for the right things, you can get those sent right to your phone by texting the word PLANS to the number that is on your screen. That's it. See you guys next time.